on these two visits, I wanted to look at two Psalms with you. Parts of the Bible I think a lot of you will be familiar with. Today, Psalm 23. And then on the time in April, it will be Psalm 46. And through each Psalm, we'll enter into them by asking a question. So when we come to Psalm 46 next month, we'll ask, how can I deal with anxiety? So Psalm 46, how can I deal with anxiety? But this week in Psalm 23, here's what we're going to ask. How do I know I'm not alone? How do I know that I'm not alone? That can be an enormous question. And I think so much of life can be faced if you know that you are not alone, that you have people who can support you and love you. But what if the main challenge that you have is that isn't you? Is that you do feel alone, that it seems that no one is there. If you look at the statistics over the last 5 years, there's been enormous reported rates in the experience of loneliness. Nearly half of adults report that they occasionally feel lonely. That number increases amongst the elderly, and that number also increases amongst younger adults too. And loneliness makes not just some things in life harder. I think loneliness makes everything in life harder. Ordinary challenges are magnified. They're made worse when you feel alone, when no one is there to help, when no one is around. And that sense of loneliness perhaps for you today is real, and perhaps it even extends to God. You may be asking, well, where is God in my loneliness? Shouldn't he be here even if everyone else has gone? And Psalm 23 is so wonderful because it helps us answer those questions. Perhaps one of the most famous poems ever written, The Lord is my shepherd. And at the very center of it is a truth that will help us address this question of how do I know I'm not alone? Because it makes the promise that even though everyone else may go, even though life may be dark and filled with trouble, God can be known. We can have the assurance that he's with us. And this is such a rich psalm. It's only short, but there is so much in it. Just two things. Let me show you two things today. I want to look at the shepherd, and then I want to think about the sheep to finish with. The shepherd, and then the sheep. So here's the first one, the shepherd. This is a psalm of David, who's king of Israel. And famously, if you know his story, he was a shepherd first. He tended the sheep for many, many years. And so he's using an image that he's personally very familiar with. And he's also using an image that would have been familiar with his readers. But one of our challenges is that we're just not very familiar with this image, or at least we think we are at one level, but this is a countryside metaphor. I said I come from the southwest. So it's very hard for me to say, I understand this. Most of you don't. But most of us are urban people. We don't live in the countryside, and we're not familiar with shepherding. So there's a distance here. But if we just press into the image a little more, then it brings a richness to what the psalm is saying to us. Because the way the psalm works is famously comparing God to being a shepherd. Verse 1, the Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. See, it's actually a common way that God is described in the Old Testament. Many places God says he is the shepherd and his people are the flock. Well, what does it mean? Well, the core of what it means to be for God to be shepherd is actually there in verse 1 as well. Because David says, I will lack nothing, or I will lack no good thing. That's what having a shepherd means. God will supply what we need, and he will never fail in doing that. We will lack nothing in an ultimate sense that we need. And really, the whole psalm is an outworking of that care. It's a way of saying, here is God as shepherd performing that kind of care. Now, if you read about shepherds, you'll find that there are three main things that they do, and you see all of them here in this psalm. Shepherds lead, they feed, and they protect. And let me just show you each one of those briefly, and then I'll return to them before we finish. A shepherd leads. See, one of the shepherds that I read, by the way, I read a lot of shepherds. There's a surprising amount of books by shepherds. And one of the shepherds said, if you ever see a sheep walking in a straight line, it's because there's either a shepherd in front or a shepherd behind. Sheep need leading. They need guidance. They need direction. And twice David talks about God leading. Look at verse 2. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. Here's it phrased in a slightly different way. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. As shepherd, God leads his people. A shepherd required a huge amount of skill and knowledge to lead well. Because one of the main ways a shepherd would lead was to bring the sheep to the second thing, to food and water. A shepherd leads and then they feed. The shepherd leads a sheep to the flock to where they're nourished, where they can thrive. The Hebrew that Psalm 23 is written in, the word for shepherd is actually a variation of a word that means to feed. The shepherd knows where to go so the sheep can be satisfied. To get both, verse 2 says, both food and water. There's a sense there of God caring for other needs too. It's one of the most beautiful images in the whole psalm that we are led beside these waters, green pastures and quiet waters. It actually translates waters of rest. Isn't that beautiful? That this shepherd leads us to waters of rest. God leading to a place where security can be known. And sheep won't rest unless they're secure, unless their needs have been met. And David sums up really by saying God is the one who refreshes his soul. Soul means life. It's complete provision. So a shepherd leads, they feed, and then they protect. Did you get that in verse 4? Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So a shepherd would carry a rod and a staff. Now, some commentators, they highlight two functions here. So the staff was a symbol of the concern of the shepherd. So it was more about kind of the well-being. So a hook staff could rescue the sheep, could be part of guiding the sheep then. It could be used to lift up the fleece, to check for health, to check that everything was fine kind of medically with the sheep. So you get the staff, but then you get the rod. The rod could be used to defend against predators, against threats to the sheep. So this is about both care and defense because sheep need both. But there's also a poetic thing happening here. Now, I get excited when poetic things happen, but I realize probably I'm the only person in the room that does. Here is simply what I mean. Rod and staff might not necessarily be two different things. Instead, it may be a poetic way of expressing completeness. A way of David basically saying, this care is total. This protection is all-enveloping. That's how comprehensive David says this is. He says he fears no evil, not because evil doesn't exist, not because evil is insignificant, but instead because of God's great protection. So do you see how powerful this picture of God as shepherd is? Psalm 23 is incredible. But here is our danger, I think. You're either very familiar with this, or you just hear this as a factual thing that actually doesn't change your experience. But David talks about God as being my shepherd. Now, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but in verse 4, you have a pivot in the psalm. Up until verse 4, David speaks about the shepherd as a he. But then in verse 4, David stops talking about the shepherd, and he starts talking to the shepherd. Did you notice? Let me read it again. Listen to what he says, verse 4, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil. How does he now talk about the shepherd? For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. He stops talking about the shepherd as a he and talks directly to him as a you. This is side-by-side companionship. This is the shepherd with you. So here is the question, how does that happen? How does a person get that kind of knowledge? Because, and this is key, when you know God like this, then all the truth and comfort of the psalm can flood into your soul. They can start addressing loneliness, isolation, despair. So how is it that God becomes shepherd? Well, do you remember in the Gospels, Jesus famously takes up this image? In fact, in one of the Gospels, Jesus takes it up in a new and a unique way. The Gospel of John, chapter 10, let me just read verse 11. This is the Gospel of John, one of the accounts of the life of Jesus, and he says this: I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. Now, all of his listeners are utterly saturated in the Old Testament. So when he says to this group who are completely saturated in all of these images of the Old Testament, they know he can only mean one thing. When he says he's the good shepherd, it's a claim to divinity. He's making himself equal with God. This is obvious to everyone listening. In fact, just a few verses later, they charge Jesus with blasphemy. And do you hear what he says he came to do? He says, I came as the good shepherd to lay down my life for my sheep. See, Psalm 23 says that to be a good shepherd is hard. There's sacrifice, there's cost. But Jesus doesn't just say we're sheep, he says we're lost sheep. And sheep that need rescue, and there will be sacrifice on the part of the shepherd, like there was on the part of every shepherd, but more than just inconvenience, more than just effort. This would cost Jesus his life to save his sheep. The psalm just before Psalm 23, surprisingly, 22, is a psalm of David as well. But this one's a hard one. David says he feels utterly forsaken. He says he feels utterly alone. But he says he knows that even though it feels so raw, that it is a feeling. But do you remember the words that Jesus speaks upon the cross? He quotes the same psalm. Psalm 22, verse 1. My God, why have you forsaken me? But for Jesus, it was no simple feeling. Jesus was utterly alone. Why? Let me put it this way. Psalm 22 and the cross is the only way to Psalm 23. It is only because Jesus goes through Psalm 22 that we can know the blessings of Psalm 23. It is only because Jesus was utterly forsaken that we can be brought into the fold. The only way God can become our good shepherd is through Jesus. Without Jesus, this psalm can't be true for you. It can't be true for me. It can't be true for anyone. The foundational answer to loneliness, that God can be with you, can only be true if you come to Jesus. And when you do, when you know Jesus as good shepherd, when you say the Lord is my shepherd, everything is different. One of the great writers of the Christian church, Martin Luther, he said the essence of the blessings of being a Christian come from being able to use personal pronouns. In other words, you can really say, God is my shepherd, and he walks with me. Do you know that? Can you say that? Because there's every difference in the world between talking about and talking to. That's the shepherd. Let me briefly finish with the angle of the sheep. What's it like to be a sheep? What's it actually like to experience God as your shepherd? So much. But let me just show you a few things from this psalm. Here's the first one. I said we come back to this. You know he's leading. Having God as your shepherd means you know that he is leading you. Now that sounds wonderful, doesn't it? And most of us can believe that until we get to a verse 4 situation. Again, I said verse 4 is a pivot. What do I mean? Well, listen again to the experience of David in verse 4. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, or the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Now, at one level, we have no problem with that because it rings true to our experience of life, doesn't it? I mean, doesn't it? That's how life feels. It feels full of deep shadow. I mean, there is literal death around us, but doesn't it also feel like death casts a longer shadow, that we walk in its valley, that sometimes we go through deep and troubling experiences? Now, here is the difficult part. At this point, David doesn't say, shepherd got lost. Shepherd took the wrong turning. Shepherd made a mistake. That's why I'm in the valley. He doesn't say that. He says the valley is part of the leading. He uses the valley. It's one of the paths of righteousness he leads us in. Now that can be extremely hard for us to understand. We could spend Sunday after Sunday just unfolding that together. There's mystery here, but remember, this is the shepherd who knows you. Go back to John 10 tonight. Read it. Jesus keeps saying, I know my sheep. Think about that. He knows you. Not just on the surface, superficially. He knows your fears, your anxieties, your joys, your hopes and expectations, the scars, the sadnesses, the burdens no one else knows. Jesus, the divine Son of God, the great shepherd, knows you, and that means he knows where your path needs to go to. Can I dare to suggest that he's better at leading your ways than you are? That he's perhaps better qualified than you are? The comfort is you can trust him even when it looks like it's leading to disaster. Now, I know how cold that can sound. I know how detached that can sound. So here's the second comfort here. You know his presence. That he walks with you in the valley. Did you notice the point at which the psalm becomes most personal? The point that David starts talking directly to God is in the valley. That's the point. It moves to the personal. It's as though the valley drives him closer to his shepherd. See, his presence with you means you can trust his leading even into the darkest of places, that you are not alone, that Jesus is walking with you. There is a yet more extraordinary thing, though, that the psalm says. It says that his presence can transform the valley. It can transform the valley into a place of blessing and abundance. Listen to verse 5. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup, it overflows. See, what is this? This is the language of blessing and extravagance. David starts talking the language of a feast. This is a celebration meal. But this is what I want you to see. Where does God prepare the table? Where does God set the feast? Where does he throw the celebration meal for us? It's not when we finally get out of the valley. It is in the middle of it. Right in the middle of the trouble, God says there can be a feast. Why? Because he's the one that sets the table. And he's the one who sits with us. Here's what we normally say. God, get me out the valley, remove my enemies, then I can feast. But God says, what if right now I prepared a table and I'm inviting you to feast with me here? See, if you think about a sheep, again, I appreciate not growing up in the West Country, most of you never do, but sheep are vulnerable. In fact, there's never really a time in the wild where a sheep isn't vulnerable. And so when you feed a sheep, it is, in that sense, always in the presence of enemies. It's always in the context of a valley. So how can a sheep ever eat safely? It's only if the shepherd is watching and protecting. That's what makes the difference. The presence of the shepherd will transform it. Nothing will despair fear and panic and terror like the presence of Christ. He has it under control, even when things appear calamitous. Many of the places we might be led into appear dark and dangerous, but they needn't be dead ends. Remember, he's there with you. Remember, he's at work. He can set a feast when the world only sees a famine. And he's leading us towards something that is part of a pathway there. He's totally committed to you, which is the last comfort. You know his absolute commitment. Verse 6, surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. This is a shepherd who finishes what he starts. What do I mean? Verse 6 says he will get us through the whole of life. That his goodness and love or mercy will follow us every day. A couple of the books by shepherds were also pastors. They were shepherds and pastors. And one of them tells a story from his days up in the Highlands of Scotland. And he was in a congregation, and an old shepherd was preaching. And he was preaching on this psalm, actually on this verse. And he said that when he thinks of this, he pictures his sheep being brought back to the farm. And the shepherd is there. He's there with his stick, but also with his 2 sheepdogs. And here's how he says he pictured it. He says one is called goodness and the other is called mercy. And they circle the sheep constantly. And as the sheep start to stray off the road, well, goodness circles, turns back, and nudges the sheep back into the path of the good shepherd. And then a little further down, another will try and do the same, and there goes mercy. Off, running out, turning the sheep back in. Always to bring them closer to the good shepherd. And he said in this lovely, old, burring Scottish accent, he said, they are 2 lovely dogs, goodness and mercy. I think of how often I've started to stray and drift. And instead of the crushing judgment I expected, I found the goodness and mercy of God lovingly drawing me back in. You know, that word there, will follow us, is a pretty weak translation. A better translation is pursue. It's more ferocious. See, no matter whatever danger pursues us, there's always a greater pursuit going on. God's goodness and love always in pursuit of us. Because verse 6 traces the pathway right to the end. The time we face death, not just as a shadow here in life, but as a reality. When days draw to a close, maybe the time above all others we feel we must face alone. But Jesus, as Good Shepherd, transforms even that. He'll be there every step of the way in this life and even through death itself. He'll walk through the final valley with us. In the words of C.S. Lewis, he said that's the point at which all other guides turn back. But not this one. Because he's already beaten a path through death and returned to bring us home with him. And that's what we'll find at the end. Verse 6 is actually a really complicated verse in the Hebrew because it has a sense that at the end of a journey is a sense of a return to the home. That we somehow at the end find ourselves at the beginning in a place that we recognize. And that's the great hope of the gospel. The end is the return to the home we lost at the beginning. To be in the house of the Lord, that is about the presence of God. Through Jesus, we'll belong in our true country. The Good Shepherd will lead us to the home we've been looking for all of our life. Here's the invite. Come to this Good Shepherd. Know him. Let him lead you. Trust him as he does. If you've never known him, this is who you need to face loneliness, to face challenge, to face difficulty and despair, to face everything in life and beyond. There is no other shepherd like this one. And yet graciously and gloriously, he's the one who's already laid down his life for us. Let me pray. Lord, I pray that you would help us to feed on your love, your grace, and your truth in Jesus. We praise you that you are always with us and you will never leave or forsake us. That even in the darkest valley, you are there. Thank you that someday you will lead us home to our true country. The home that we've been longing for and desiring all of our lives. This afternoon, meet us in our loneliness. Assure us of your presence and lead us in the way everlasting. Amen.